welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we are taking a necessary and pretty difficult look into the psychological architecture of one of America's most infamous serial killers, Ted Bundy.
We have a really dense stack of sources for you today. Everything from forensic psychiatry research on the dark triad, all the way to Dr. Dorothy Otnow Lewis's clinical work.
And our mission here is to really understand that terrifying contradiction at the heart of this man.
Yeah, and how that contradiction allowed him to thrive, to be such a successful predator for so long across so many states.
The contradiction is the core of it, isn't it?
Yeah.
I mean, he just completely defied the stereotype of a violent criminal.
Absolutely. Bundy was handsome, he was articulate, highly intelligent.
Psychology major who then went on to law school.
Right. And he was even politically active. He volunteered for people like Nelson Rockefeller and Governor Daniel J. Evans. He was, for all intents and purposes, the kind of guy you'd be happy to introduce to your parents.
And that duality, the charming, civilized man who was also this brutal, calculating monster, that was the key to his success.
It was everything. So today we're going to spend some time unpacking the framework developed by Dr. Lewis, who you mentioned. She studied hundreds of violent offenders, including Bundy himself, to try and understand what she called the recipe for violence.
A recipe. That idea suggests that this isn't something someone is just born with, but something that's created.
Exactly. Dr. Lewis documented her findings in that documentary. Crazy, not insane.
And what was her foundational conclusion? After all those interviews, what did she find at the core of these violent acts?
Well, she fundamentally rejected the idea of inherent evil. She was very, very clear on this point. She said evil is a religious concept, not a medical or scientific one.
So it's not a diagnosis.
Not at all. Her clinical conclusion, based on years of interviews and neurological data, was that people like Bundy were not born dangerous. They weren't born evil. Something had to go profoundly wrong along the way.
Okay, so if it wasn't predestined, what were the ingredients? What did she find in this recipe for violence?
Working with a neurologist, Dr. Jonathan Pincus, she identified a three-part framework. The first ingredient is a predisposition to mental illness.
Okay.
Things like psychosis, issues that can run in the family.
And the second ingredient, that gets into the physical brain itself.
Yes, exactly. The second factor is abnormal brain dysfunction. This is typically damage or some kind of malformation in the frontal and temporal lobes.
Which are the parts of the brain that control our impulses.
Right. They're the brain's regulators. They govern judgment, impulse control, emotional processing. So damage there literally impairs a person's ability to stop themselves.
And the final ingredient, the one that she found connected almost all of these highly violent men.
The third factor is horrific childhood abuse. Lewis found this trauma was so pervasive and severe that it often led to some form of dissociative identity disorder, or DDT.
What used to be called multiple personality disorder.
That's the one. The mind literally splits itself off to cope with the pain. She believed these violent alternate personalities were just coping mechanisms, caricatures of power created by children who had none.
Okay, let's zero in on Bundy's history then. How does his life provide the kindling for that crucial factor of trauma? His early life was, it was rooted in a huge family deception.
That deception is really where the psychological fracturing begins. He was born Theodore Cowell in 1946. His mother, Eleanor Louise Cowell, was unwed.
And in that era, that was a huge social stigma.
A crushing stigma. So to avoid it, his maternal grandparents stepped in. They raised him, and they insisted that they were his parents.
And that his biological mother was his older sister.
Yes, a staggering lie to build a childhood on.
I can't even imagine. How did he react when he finally found out the truth?
Well, he eventually found his birth certificate. Some accounts say it was when he was a teen, others say early 20s. But regardless of when it happened, the sources all agree the discovery caused deep psychological trauma.
And a resentment toward his mother.
A lifelong umbrage, as one source put it. It just created this massive identity crisis right at the core of his being. I mean, his entire life was a lie.
And it wasn't just the lie, right? The actual home environment wasn't stable either. That must have just compounded the trauma.
It did. His home life was the definition of volatile. His grandfather, Samuel Cowell, was apparently a terrifying figure, aggressive, misogynistic, and he showed clear signs of psychosis.
What do you mean?
He would speak violently to imaginary people. He was abusive to his wife, and chillingly to animals.
So you have this unstable mix of deception and volatility. And you can see it start to manifest in Bundy's own behavior very, very early on.
Oh, the red flags were there almost from the start. They were terrifying markers.
Like the story with the knives.
Yeah. When he was just 3 years old, his aunt woke up from a nap, and there's little Ted standing silently beside her, smiling. And all around her on the bed are kitchen knives, deliberately placed.
3 years old. That's not a normal childhood tantrum. That's calculated.
Exactly. It shows this early, cold preoccupation with power and instilling fear. And it escalated from there. Later, there were acts of gratuitous animal cruelty.
Like setting a cat on fire.
Yes. And then he moved on to other children. He built what he called punji traps in the woods, these crude, hidden traps. And they worked. He injured a young girl.
It seems like he channeled all of that internal chaos and low self-worth into this growing obsession with dominance and violence.
The sources all confirm that. As a teen, he had intense social insecurity, really low self-esteem. He coped by relying more and more on fantasy instead of reality.
And his fantasies were?
Obsessed with detective stories, stories focused on violent crimes against women. That reliance on violent fantasy was the precursor to the meticulous persona he would build later on.
And that persona became his ultimate weapon. The handsome, witty psychology and law student.
He was building the perfect mask of sanity. But this is where it gets really interesting because the sources point to one pivotal identity-shattering moment.
His college girlfriend.
His rejection by his high-status college girlfriend, Diane Edwards. She's often known by the pseudonym Stephanie Brooks.
And she broke up with him because she thought he was immature, that he lacked ambition.
That's right. And Dr. Lewis considered this breakup probably the pivotal time in his development. For a man who's already suffering an identity crisis rooted in his own birth, this rejection wasn't just heartbreak.
It was a confirmation of his worthlessness.
An absolute confirmation of his low status. So he didn't just retreat.
No, he calculated.
He used that rejection as rocket fuel. He dropped out of sight, he excelled in school, threw himself into politics, and he meticulously created the successful, charming man she said he wasn't.
And then he went back to her.
Sought her out, won her back completely, and then instantly discarded her.
Wow.
It was an act of pure, calculated revenge. It was about dominance, proving he was superior. He finally had absolute control over her.
That chilling lack of emotion right there, it confirms the clinical profile we need to talk about. The dark triad. He wasn't just cruel, he was clinically defined.
He is, tragically, a textbook case. Bundy fits all three parts of the dark triad: psychopathy, narcissism, and Machiavellianism. Clinically, he was classified as a primary psychopath.
Let's break that down. When he was evaluated, what did his psychopathy scores actually tell us?
His scores on the Hare psychopathy checklist, the PCLR, were consistently through the roof, often 35 or higher out of a possible 40.
And a score that high signifies what exactly?
Complete emotional detachment, a deep-seated lack of what we call effective empathy.
We hear that term empathy a lot. Can you clarify the distinction? The kind he lacked versus the kind he actually used to manipulate his victims.
Sure. So effective empathy is the ability to feel what another person is feeling, to experience their fear or their pain. Bundy had none of that.
But he could read people.
He had excellent cognitive empathy. That's the ability to read other people's emotions, understand their vulnerabilities, and predict how they'll react.
So he could see your fear and use it against you, but he couldn't actually feel it or care about it.
Precisely. And that coldness is what made him such a devastating predator. His lack of remorse confirms it. He once told an interviewer, "I am in the enviable position of not having to feel any guilt."
That's chilling. Okay, moving to the second part of the triad, narcissism. How did that show up in his actions?
While his narcissistic personality disorder came out as this intense grandiosity, he genuinely believed he was special, that he was above the rules that applied to everyone else.
The most famous example being his trial.
Right. His insistence on firing his lawyers and representing himself during his capital murder trials. He wasn't doing it to win. He was doing it for the status, for the stage. It was a chance to prove his intellectual superiority to the world.
In the final piece, Machiavellianism, that's just pure manipulation.
That's the strategic side, yeah. It's characterized by exploiting others, viewing people as pawns, or as he chillingly described women.
As merchandise?
As merchandise. He was a master of deceit, the false identities, the famous arm cast ruse to get sympathy. He weaponized kindness and basic human empathy against his victims.
That chilling level of organization is so clear in his modus operandi and his very specific victim selection.
Incredibly specific. He almost exclusively targeted young, attractive, white, college-aged women.
With a particular look.
Yes, with long, dark brown hair, parted in the middle. Many people theorize this was a substitute for Diane Edwards, the girlfriend who rejected him, or maybe some symbolic female figure he resented.
And the crimes themselves weren't disorganized bursts of rage.
Not at all. He was classified as a power control serial killer and an organized lust killer. His violence was highly ritualistic, goal-oriented.
Though the pattern was.
Abduction, rape, blunt trauma, strangulation, and then, horrifyingly, necrophilia. He would return to the bodies later to groom them or perform sexual acts.
That necrophilia really highlights the need for absolute control, doesn't it?
It wasn't just about the murder. It was about attaining complete passive dominance over his victim, even after death. The sources describe his urge to kill as this overwhelming addictive condition that was all tied up with sexual dominance.
And he was able to keep this spree going for 4 years. Across 7 states. And that wasn't just because of his mask. It was a genuine systemic failure of law enforcement at the time.
Absolutely. Bundy actively exploited the limitations of 1970s policing. The biggest vulnerability was something we now call linkage blindness.
Yeah.
Back then, there was no centralized system, no FBI VICAP program, no CODIS database to share forensic information across state lines.
So if he killed in Washington and then drove to Utah, those 2 investigations were completely separate.
Exactly. The police operated in these jurisdictional silos. As long as Bundy kept moving, local departments had no way of knowing a string of strikingly similar murders were happening somewhere else. His mobility was his best protection.
And on top of that institutional failure, you had the halo effect caused by his charm.
This was the social blind spot. His clean-cut law student appearance created an unconscious bias. Investigators just couldn't reconcile the charming, educated young man with the monster they were looking for.
So they dismissed tips.
They dismissed tips constantly, including tips that were submitted repeatedly by his own longtime girlfriend, Elizabeth Klupfer, because he just didn't fit their narrow idea of what a violent criminal looked like.
It just goes to show you how dangerous it is to equate attractiveness and education with innocence.
It absolutely is. And it let him slip through the net for years until his final, very dramatic arrest. He became a celebrity, engineered 2 escapes,
including jumping from a courthouse window.
From a second-story window while he was preparing his own defense. The whole saga became the first nationally televised trial in U.S. history.
But the system did finally connect him, didn't it? With a forensic technique that was pretty new at the time.
It was a pivotal moment in forensic history. During his Florida trial for the Chi Omega sorority murders, the prosecution used forensic odontology.
Bite mark analysis.
Bite mark analysis, yes. The distinctive, unique bite mark left on the body of victim Lisa Levy was conclusively matched to Bundy's dental records.
That was the physical evidence that cut through the mask, cut across state lines. It was irrefutable.
It was the critical link, the thing that finally secured his conviction and ultimately his death sentence.
So let's wrap up by talking about that final, really controversial claim Bundy made right before his execution. He tried to shift the blame to violent pornography. What was that all about?
On the afternoon before he was executed, he gave this big, widely broadcasted interview to James Dobson, the founder of Focus on the Family.
Right.
And in it, Bundy claimed that violent pornography was the root cause of his crimes. He compared the compulsion to an addiction, saying he needed more potent, more explicit material until he felt he had to act it out in reality.
That just sounds like a classic last-ditch attempt to place the blame somewhere else.
And that's how Dr. Lewis and most researchers saw it. A final, desperate manipulation. He was conveniently catering to Dobson's known political agenda against pornography.
And he even contradicted himself later, didn't he?
He did. He later said something like, "I never said pornography made me do it. I said that to get them to help me. I did murder because I wanted to do it."
So, his motives aside, what does the actual clinical research say? Is there a scientific link between violent media and real-world violence?
Well, it's complex, but the data does not support his claim. Research shows that while violent pornography correlates weakly, maybe an R value of about 0.24 with negative attitudes toward women,
it doesn't actually lead to more violence?
It has not been scientifically linked to an increase in real-world sexual violence. In fact, if you look at U.S. statistics, rates of rape and sexual assault have generally decreased since the 60s and 70s, even with the explosion of internet pornography.
So even when we account for the brain dysfunction and the trauma, We come back to moral responsibility.
Exactly. While Dr. Lewis provides the clinical context, that severe trauma and frontal lobe damage can drastically reduce a person's capacity for choice, that moral dimension is still there.
Right.
People ultimately have to be held accountable for their actions. Society has a right to be protected, even if we can't cure the underlying condition yet.
And that emphasis on the trauma that creates the killer, that's what Dr. Lewis really carried with her long after the Bundy case was over. She was trying to prevent the next monster, not just profile the last one.
That's right. Her later work really shifted away from historical killers like Bundy. She started focusing on preventing the kind of foundational trauma that leads to this violence in the first place.
And she focused on a very contemporary issue.
She did. She turned her attention to the separation of young children from their parents at the border.
She publicly condemned that policy. She said it was inflicting the exact type of trauma she'd spent her entire life studying.
She called it torture, an unforgivable directive. Because for her, it was the deliberate infliction of the key ingredient for violence: severe state-sponsored childhood trauma. She understood that those experiences don't just create psychological damage in one person, they threaten the whole moral fabric of society.
So if childhood trauma truly is the foundational ingredient in this chilling recipe for violence, we have to ask ourselves, how should society ethically address systemic policies and institutions that actively inflict these deep psychological wounds? And in doing so, are potentially cultivating the next generation of profoundly disturbed individuals? That is the question we leave you to explore.